Crimes against humanity in German history are more often than not associated with the Second World War and the Nazi extermination campaigns against Jews, Slavic peoples, Roma, Sinti, and others. These horrors are often considered the pinnacle of racialized evil, but also as something unique in German history, a sudden, fleeting madness that had taken hold of German society in the 1930s. However, the evils committed in the Second World War were based on a racist ideology that preceded the rise of National Socialism. In fact, it was rooted in the supremacist ideas that allowed for the violent expansion of the German colonial empire back in the 19th century. The German colonial empire was relatively limited compared to its European competitors, and its most significant areas covered only a couple of African countries, namely Southwestern German Africa, German Eastern Africa, and German Cameroon, now known as Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon respectively. The violence committed in these colonies was so extreme the German colonies at the time were known as the so-called whipping colonies. However, due to the fact these German colonies were rather short-lived, and due to the enduring impact of Germans' role in both the First and Second World War, little attention has been given to this dark chapter in German history. It is a history so unknown that some Africans are under the impression that German colonialism was rather mild and even-handed compared to their later colonial oppressors, such as the French. This is incorrect, and in this video we will show why the cruelty of German colonialism was almost unparalleled at the time, and would lay the foundation of Germany's bloody march through the 20th century. Let us start with one of Germany's lesser-known colonies, Cameroon. Cameroon was a colony that lasted from 1984 until 1916, after which it was divided amongst the victors of the First World War. Cameroon covered the area which is now the Republic of Cameroon, but also small parts of what is now Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. Originally, the colony was built and expanded upon by means of treaties with local rulers that would allow for German concession companies to use parts of the land for trade and cultivation. However, later German incursions became increasingly violent. The new German governor of Cameroon, Jesko von Puttkamer, would start violent military campaign aimed at bringing new areas under German control and root out possible local dissidents. Von Puttkamer, who subscribed to a more ruthless form of colonial expansion, did not hide his disdain for the native black Africans. He described the Douala people of Cameroon as the most lazy, false, and base rabble the sun ever shone upon, and it would certainly have been better if during the conquest of the land in 1884 they had at least been kicked out of the country if not exterminated. Puttkamer would harshly punish villages that would reject German rule by taking large groups of men as slaves, or massacring entire villages. In one instance, he ordered all babies of one village be sent in baskets into the river to drown. Even more subtle forms of anti-colonial criticism by the colonized people were not permitted. In 1914, Douala Mangabel, a local king in Cameroon and an anti-colonial activist, was hanged for high treason after a mock trial, meant to silence any native anti-colonial activities. But yielding to their German usurpers proved fruitless for local communities, for their woes were far from over. The large-scale plantations used by the German concession companies often lacked a local labor force. Von Puttkamer put labor quotas on the conquered local communities, who had to provide the concession companies with groups of people who would be forced to work on the plantations. The Germans went to extreme lengths to maintain order and obedience on their plantations. Local workers could be punished by having their fingers, toes, or hands cut off, or by having their genitals sliced off or their eyes gouged out. Beheadings were also common, and these atrocities were so flagrant German missionaries stationed in Cameroon started voicing their shock and disapproval. After Puttkamer left his position, German expansions became less violent and allowed for more development to occur. Unfortunately, the German bloodshed in Cameroon only completely ended with the Germany's loss in World War I, after which they were forced to hand over their colonies to other European powers, including German Cameroon, divided amongst the French and the British. French Cameroon and British Cameroon eventually reunified to form the present Republic of Cameroon. The second colony in German Africa was that of German East Africa, a colony that covered present-day Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, and a small part of Mozambique. Similarly to Cameroon, the colonization of German East Africa started with a number of treaties signed by local rulers in the area. In 1885, the German Empire granted Karl Peters, leader of the Society for German Colonization, an imperial charter allowing him to put the entire area under so-called German protection. However, many local rulers refused German rule with brutal consequences. The military groups under Karl Peters began laying waste to all communities and tribes that rejected German rule, and left a horrifying trail of blood and destruction in their wake. Karl Peters, like Jesko von Puttkamer, became notorious for his violence. The natives nicknamed him the man with the blood-soaked hands. He slaughtered entire villages and took many local women by force to become part of his native harem. These women could be whipped or even executed when Peters had no more use for them. Another hallmark of Peters' brutality, and that of his peers in other German colonies, was the use of the whip as a form of punishment. The violence eventually led to several uprisings. The most infamous of these uprisings was the 1905 rebellion, which was mercilessly crushed by the German rulers, who not only relied on brute firepower but also orchestrated a large-scale famine to crush the rebellion. Up to 300,000 people lost their lives as a result of the German actions against the 1905 rebellion. The last colony we will discuss was also the most well-known, namely German Southwest Africa, which would later become the current country of Namibia. The German flag was first raised in Southwest Africa in 1884, and German claims to the land were confirmed during the Berlin Conference in 1885. After the discovery of rich mineral deposits, total monopoly was given to a newly formed colonial company, the DKGSWA, and they were given free rein to extract these precious minerals. The influx of German settlers and further encroachment on native lands created tension with the original African inhabitants. The German colonial government envisioned the colony as one consisting of mostly white settlers, relegating the native populations to specifically created reservations, while their original lands would be claimed by the new waves of immigrants. The natives were expressly forbidden from becoming German subjects. They could either inhabit the reservations or leave the land. What's more, German settlers were not only allowed to take land but also use the local tribes as slaves for farm work. This eventually led to revolts, mainly by two ethnic groups in the region, the Herero and Nama peoples. The violence spiraled out of control, and General Lothar von Trotha was sent in by German Emperor Wilhelm II to settle the dispute. General von Trotha, who, just like the German Emperor, considered the African tribes racially inferior, opted for the most drastic intervention possible. He argued that the African only responds to brute force, and that it would be best that the nation should be annihilated or expelled from the lands. After slaughtering thousands of Herero men, women, and children at the Battle of Waterberg, the general ordered his troops to prevent the survivors of the battle who fled into the desert to ever return, in practice condemning them to die of hunger and thirst. To make sure none would be left alive, they poisoned all the water wells in the area. Many of the other Herero and Nama people were sent to large-scale concentration camps, where they were forced into slave labor. The conditions in these concentration camps were appalling. Famine and disease were widespread, and the prisoners were often subjected to brutal torture, sexual abuse, and humiliation. The most infamous of all the concentration camps was the Shark Island concentration camp, built on the eponymous peninsula in the far southwest of the colonial territory. Between 1,000 and 3,000 people died in the camp due to a combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, and torture. When people died, other prisoners, who were more often than not relatives of the deceased, were forced to boil and prepare the heads of the dead prisoners for taxonomy. The severed heads were then sent to German scientists for further experimentation and research. One of the main scientists involved in this gruesome undertaking was Eugen Fischer, a German professor of medicine, anthropology, and eugenics. He studied the remains of the local Africans as part of his race science. Fischer was a proponent of the idea of racial purity. He sterilized Herero women and recommended that interracial mixing be forbidden in the German colonies. This recommendation was taken to heart by the German rulers, who forbade interracial marriage in the colonies in 1912. Eugen Fischer later became a member of the Nazi Party, and his later research would become part of the justification for the Nazi race laws in Germany. The genocide started in 1904 and ended in 1908, and eventually cost the lives of roughly 100,000 people in total, which was a significant part of the total population at the time. Some historians even argue that the violent tactics and social Darwinistic ideologies employed during the Namibian genocide and the German colonial rule in general set a precedent for the later Nazi extermination campaigns during the Second World War. Although the violence in Southwest Africa and other colonies did cause some uproar in Germany at the time, the international community stayed mostly silent. E.D. Morel, who spearheaded the international campaign against the atrocities under Leopoldian rule in the Congo, was a staunch supporter of German colonialism and made no mention of the crimes committed by the Germans, much to the chagrin and disbelief of some of his contemporaries. When Germany lost World War I, it was forced to relinquish its African colonies, which were distributed amongst the victors of the war, such as France and Great Britain. This, together with Germany's role in World War II, has caused some of the memories of the German colonial empire to fade and disappear in the mists of history. But these atrocities happened nevertheless and should not be forgotten, out of respect for the many victims of the German imperial dream. Thanks for watching, and check out some of the other videos on colonial history on this channel.